The year is 1338. Somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia, a man named Sanmaq is dying. His gravestone will read, "He died of pestilence." And that single stone, buried for centuries, holds the answer to one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Where did the Black Death actually begin? This video is about the exact moment the deadliest pandemic in human history was unleashed on the world. Most people think they know this story. Rats, fleas, medieval Europe, bodies piling up in the streets. But here's what almost nobody tells you. The real origin was solved only in 2022. It started somewhere that's now underwater, and the strain that killed half of Europe, its descendants are still circulating today. I've spent weeks going deep on this, pulling from genetic studies, archaeological digs, and historical records most people have never heard of. And what I found is so much stranger and more terrifying than the version you learned in school. Here's where we're going. We're starting in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan 9 years before the plague hits Europe. Then we're following it across the Silk Road, through the ports of the Black Sea, and straight into the heart of medieval civilization. By the end, you'll understand not just what happened, but why nothing could have stopped it. Let's go. To understand the Black Death, you have to go back further than most people do. Way further. The bacterium that caused it, Yersinia pestis, didn't just appear in the 14th century. Genetic analysis shows it evolved approximately 7,000 years ago, at the very dawn of human civilization. The version that could be spread by fleas emerged around 3,800 years ago, during the late Bronze Age. This thing had been quietly evolving, hiding in rodent populations, waiting for millennia before it ever touched Europe. Think about that. While Rome rose and fell, while the pyramids were built, while empires came and went, this bacterium was out there, patient, evolving, getting better at what it does. And what it does is kill. But here's the thing, for most of those thousands of years, it stayed contained, locked inside rodent populations in the grasslands of Central Asia. So what changed? What finally set it loose? This is where the story gets genuinely surprising. The answer isn't war, it isn't trade, it isn't even human contact, it's the weather. In the decades leading up to the 1340s, Central Asia experienced significant climate shifts. Droughts hit the grasslands, the steppe dried out, and when the grasslands shrink, the rodents that live in them don't just die, they move. They flood into areas closer to human settlements, carrying their fleas with them, carrying the bacterium inside those fleas. More rodents near people means more chances for a flea to jump from a marmot to a human. And marmots are everywhere in the Tian Shan mountain region of what is now Kyrgyzstan, southern Kazakhstan, and northwestern China. Big furry ground squirrels. The Mongols loved eating them. They'd hunted and eaten marmots for generations. It was completely normal, a cultural staple, except somewhere around 1338, a meal became a catastrophe. One bite, one flea, one moment of contact between the ancient bacterium and a human host, and the clock started ticking on the worst pandemic in recorded human history. Now, we know this because of a discovery that sounds almost too cinematic to be real. The breakthrough didn't come from a lab. It came from a historian noticing something weird in old cemetery records. Researchers studying burial sites near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan spotted an anomaly. In 1338 and 1339, the number of burials at these sites suddenly spiked. Not a small increase, a massive, unexplained surge, way more people dying than normal. And the gravestones, some of them, listed the cause of death, pestilence. That's when scientists moved in. They extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of the buried individuals, and what they found confirmed what historians had suspected but never proven. The genetic material matched the ancestral strain of Yersinia pestis, the direct ancestor of the bacteria that would go on to kill half of Europe. This was published in the journal Nature in 2022, a 675-year-old mystery solved by ancient DNA and a historian who noticed a spike in a burial count. And one of those graves belongs to Sanmaq. His name is on a stone. In the year 1338, and it was the year of the tiger, this is the tomb of the believer Sanmaq. He died of pestilence. History usually gives us numbers. 50 million dead. A third of Europe. Abstract, impossible figures. But Sanmaq gives it a face, a real person with a name who was among the first to die from something that would reshape the entire world. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary. The site where Sanmaq and the other early victims are buried, the trading city that was likely ground zero for the entire outbreak, it's underwater. A massive earthquake in the 15th century submerged the ancient Silk Road settlement near Lake Issyk-Kul. The city sank, and for 500 years, the first victims of the Black Death lay at the bottom of a lake, completely unreachable. Archaeologists have only recently begun excavating it. We are literally just now uncovering the origin point of the deadliest pandemic in human history. That detail stops me every time I think about it. The answer was there the whole time, buried underwater, waiting. Now, once the plague had a foothold in the human population near Issyk-Kul, it needed a highway to travel. And in the 14th century, there was no better highway on Earth than the Silk Road. The Mongol Empire had, in a brutal and unintentional way, created the perfect conditions for a pandemic. They'd unified vast stretches of Central Asia and China under a single network of trade and military supply chains. Goods, people, and animals moved constantly across thousands of miles. And among those goods, grain. The Mongols gathered enormous quantities of grain to feed their armies on campaign, specifically a type of millet grown in the Tian Shan region, the exact same region where the plague was already burning through the rodent population. Sacks of grain were loaded onto carts and horses and shipped across the empire, to fortresses, to cities under siege, to trading posts along the road. And into those grain sacks crawled rodents carrying fleas carrying Yersinia pestis. Something as ordinary as a bag of millet may have carried the plague from a mountain valley in Kyrgyzstan all the way to the shores of the Black Sea. The Mongols didn't know they were doing it. Nobody did. But their supply chains became a biological conveyor belt, moving the deadliest pathogen on Earth across a continent. By the mid-1340s, the plague had reached the Crimean Peninsula on the northern edge of the Black Sea, and that's where the story gets to the part everyone thinks they know, but mostly gets wrong. You've probably heard the story. Mongols besieging the city of Kaffa. Plague breaks out in their camp. They catapult infected corpses over the city walls. The disease gets in. Genoese merchants flee by ship. They carry it to Sicily. Europe is doomed. It's a great story. It's almost certainly not true. Modern medical evidence shows that plague-infected corpses are not actually a reliable vector for transmission. The bacterium dies relatively quickly in a dead body. Hurling corpses over walls is dramatic, but it probably wouldn't have caused an outbreak. More likely, the plague got into Kaffa the same way it got everywhere else. Infected rodents, in grain shipments, crawling through the city's food stores, the fleas doing what fleas do. The catapult story has origins in religious and eschatological writing from the period. People trying to make sense of something incomprehensible by giving it a dramatic, almost divine cause. A punishment launched from the sky. It's a better story than grain sack with a rat in it, but the grain sack is probably what actually happened. And if you think the grain sack version is less scary, you're wrong. It's more scary because it means there was no single dramatic moment to point to. No one act that could have been stopped. Just ordinary commerce, ordinary movement, the mundane machinery of civilization quietly carrying death from one end of the world to the other. That's the part that should keep you up at night. Now, here's where the story becomes almost incomprehensible in scale. In October 1347, Genoese trading ships arrived in the port of Messina, Sicily. The sailors were sick. Many were already dead. The living had strange black swellings on their bodies, at the armpits, in the groin, on the neck, weeping blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of port immediately. It was too late. Within weeks, the plague was spreading through Sicily. Within months, it had reached mainland Italy. By 1348, it was in France, Spain, England. By 1350, it had swept through Scandinavia and into Russia. In roughly 3 years, it crossed an entire continent. Medieval civilization had no concept of germ theory, no understanding of bacteria, no idea what a flea was doing when it bit you. The best explanations available were astrological, a bad alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, or divine, God's punishment for human sin. Treatment ranged from useless to actively harmful: bloodletting, burning aromatic herbs, rubbing onions on the swellings, flagellants marching through cities whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath. Jewish communities were massacred across Europe, blamed for poisoning wells, one of history's most vicious and senseless scapegoating campaigns, carried out while the actual cause crawled through the grain stores of every city on the continent. Nothing worked. Nothing could work, because nobody knew what they were fighting, and the numbers that came out the other side of this are staggering. Somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population died. Some regions lost 70 or 80%. Villages were wiped out completely. Entire family lines ended. The labor force collapsed. The church lost so many clergy that its authority never fully recovered. The social order that had defined European life for centuries cracked and began to shift. The world that came out the other side of the Black Death was fundamentally different from the world that went in. Now here's the final detail, the one that makes this story feel less like history and more like something ongoing. Remember that ancestral strain from 1338 Kyrgyzstan, the one that killed Sanmaq, the one that spread through the Mongol grain routes and arrived in Sicily in 1347? At the time of the Black Death, that strain underwent what scientists call a Big Bang explosion of diversity. It split into 4 new lineages of Yersinia pestis, 4 branches of a bacterial family tree, all exploding outward from that single 14th century ancestor. Those 4 lineages still exist. Their descendants circulate today in 40 species of rodents around the world. Marmots in Central Asia, prairie dogs in the American Southwest, rodents in Africa, in South America, in China. The plague never went away. It retreated back into the animal population, where it has lived for thousands of years, where it continues to evolve. A few hundred human cases are still reported globally every year. The strain that killed half of Europe is, as one researcher put it, literally the mother of all modern plague, and she's still out there. So let's bring this all the way back. In 1338, in a mountain valley in what is now Kyrgyzstan, a man named Sanmaq died of pestilence. His city now sits at the bottom of a lake. The bacterium that killed him had been evolving for 7,000 years, waiting for the right conditions. A climate shift, a hungry marmot, a grain sack on a Mongol supply cart. It rode the Silk Road to the Black Sea, slipped into a port city, not through a dramatic catapult launch, but through the ordinary movement of goods and rodents, and arrived in Sicily in October 1347 on a ship full of dying sailors. Medieval civilization never had a chance, not because they were stupid or weak, but because they were fighting something invisible, something ancient, something that had been perfecting itself since before the pyramids were built. They had no framework for understanding it, and by the time anyone grasped the scale of what was happening, it was already everywhere. What I keep coming back to is Sanmaq. One name, one gravestone. 9 years before the ships arrived in Sicily. He had no idea what he'd started. Nobody did. History usually hides its beginnings. This one was buried under a lake for 500 years, and we only just found it.